Horten Ho-229. Deep inside an American aerospace restoration facility, stripped of its paint and sitting in the dim light, is an object that looks entirely out of time. It is a massive, skeletal flying wing. If you stood in front of its 55-foot span, taking in its smooth, tailless geometry, you would instantly recognize the silhouette. It looks almost exactly like a modern B-2 stealth bomber. But this airframe wasn't built in the 1990s. It was pulled from a German forest by advancing Allied troops in the spring of 1945. This is the Horten Ho-229, specifically the surviving V-3 prototype. For decades, it has been the centerpiece of one of the most persistent technological legends of the Second World War, the myth of Hitler's stealth bomber. The story begins not with a desire for invisibility, but with a frantic demand for speed. In 1943, the German High Command issued the seemingly impossible 3 × 1,000 directive. They wanted an aircraft capable of carrying 1,000 kilograms of explosives at 1,000 kilometers an hour, over a distance of 1,000 kilometers. The Horten brothers, Reimar and Walter, believed the only way to achieve this mathematical extreme was to eliminate aerodynamic drag entirely. They designed a pure flying wing. The anatomy of the Ho-229 is a masterclass in minimalist engineering. Shaped like a sleek manta ray, the center section was built from welded steel tubing to house the pilot and 2 massive Jumo 004 jet engines. But the vast, sweeping wings were constructed almost entirely out of layers of plywood. The aircraft was undeniably real. The V-2 prototype actually flew, proving that a tailless jet could slice through the air at terrifying speeds before a mid-air failure caused a crash that killed its test pilot. But when American forces captured the unfinished V-3 model and brought it back to the United States for analysis, they discovered something strange beneath the wooden surface. The Horten brothers had mixed charcoal dust, carbon into the wood glue holding the layers of plywood together. This detail is where documented history bleeds into post-war legend. Decades after the war, Reimar Horten made a startling claim. He stated that the carbon mixture and the smooth, tailless shape were not just for aerodynamics. He claimed they were specifically engineered to absorb and deflect electromagnetic waves. According to this narrative, the Ho-229 was the world's first true stealth aircraft, intentionally designed to slip invisibly through the British chain-home early warning radar network. The story suggested that if the war had lasted just a few more months, squadrons of invisible bombers would have darkened the skies over London without a single alarm sounding. It is a chilling thought, but the physical archive refuses to fully cooperate. The evidence that would close the case is missing. The original, unedited wartime design memos and rigorous radar test data from 1944 have never surfaced. We have the captured airframe, but we are missing the documents that prove the German High Command actually understood the physics of radar evasion at the time. Modern tests on the surviving V-3 airframe have confirmed something fascinating. The shape of the plane, combined with the wooden wings, naturally reduced its radar cross-section. It would have been slightly harder to spot on early radar screens, buying it a few extra minutes of surprise. But aviation historians fiercely dispute whether this was a deliberate act of genius. The competing explanation is much simpler, rooted in the collapse of a dying regime. The plane was built of wood because Germany had simply run out of aircraft-grade aluminum. The carbon was likely added to the glue to protect the fragile wooden airframe from the intense, corrosive heat of the jet engines buried inside it. Furthermore, Reimar Horten only began heavily promoting the stealth narrative in the 1980s, right around the time the United States military was publicly unveiling its own top-secret stealth technology. The radar-evading characteristics may have been nothing more than a brilliant accidental byproduct of trying to build a plane fast enough to outrun an interceptor. Yet the legend of the Nazi stealth bomber survives, largely because of what happens when we look at the machine. It is incredibly difficult for the human brain to trace the sweeping, futuristic curves of the Ho-229, and accept that it was just a wooden glider strapped to a pair of jet engines. The Horten Ho 229 looks exactly like the future of warfare, but the legend of its purpose was mostly built in the past. It stands as a phantom in the archives, a reminder that sometimes sheer desperation accidentally molds the exact shape of the future. Bachem Va-349 Natter. In the quiet cold of a snowy German forest near Stetten am Kalten Markt, a solitary wooden tower stood above the tree line. In early 1945, strapped vertically to a rail on this tower, sat a machine that defied every conventional rule of aviation. It was a stubby, teardrop-shaped wooden cylinder with wings so impossibly small it looked less like an aircraft and more like a manned torpedo. Waiting at the base was a 22-year-old pilot named Lothar Sieber. His orders were to wedge himself into the claustrophobic cockpit and ignite the solid fuel rockets mounted just inches behind his spine. This was the Bachem 349 Natter, or Viper, one of the most bizarre and deeply unsettling artifacts of the Second World War. By late 1944, as Allied bomber formations devastated German cities, the Luftwaffe grew desperate. Runways were being cratered daily. In response, they authorized a mass-produced interceptor that didn't need an airfield. The object's anatomy was brutal in its simplicity. The pilot would launch vertically, riding a column of fire directly into the bomber formations above to fire a barrage of nose-mounted rockets. Because the wooden Natter had no landing gear, coming back down required a terrifying mechanical sequence. The pilot was supposed to unlatch his harness and allow the fuselage to violently split in half mid-air, deploying parachutes that would carry both the pilot and the reusable rocket engine safely to the ground. That was what was documented on the blueprints. But this is where the mechanical reality and the alleged intent of the machine begin to fracture, leaving behind a dark historical debate. On March 1, 1945, Lothar Sieber became the first and only man to fly the Natter. Witnesses watched as the wooden rocket screamed upward on a massive column of smoke. But midway through the ascent, the flight path suddenly arced into a fatal dive, plunging into the earth and killing Sieber instantly. Almost immediately, rumors began to circulate that the Natter was never truly meant to be survivable. After the war, claims emerged that the SS, who had taken control of the program, viewed the Natter as a thinly veiled kamikaze craft. According to these later accounts, the intricate mid-air breakaway sequence was an elaborate psychological fiction designed to trick young pilots into the cockpit, masking the reality that it was an act of institutional suicide. The evidence that could resolve this remains missing. There was no flight data recorder in the cramped cabin. We do not have clear visual telemetry of the flight's apex, nor do we possess the complete operational deployment orders that might detail how many youths were destined for these launches. We do not even know what Sieber experienced in his 14 seconds airborne. Investigators offer competing explanations for the fatal crash. The most ordinary theory suggests a simple mechanical failure. An improperly secured canopy latch snapped under the immense pressure, flying back and knocking Sieber unconscious before he could attempt to bail out. But the more terrifying interpretation is physiological. The unguided solid rocket boosters produced an acceleration so violently extreme that the human body may not have been able to withstand it. The Natter might not have required a mechanical failure to kill its pilot. The sheer, blinding G-force of the launch itself may have been a death sentence by design. Without the missing telemetry, the exact cause of Sieber's death is lost to the forest floor. But the unresolved nature of the crash is precisely why the legend of the Natter survives. It forces us to ask at what point a weapon of defense becomes an act of madness. The Bachem 349 Natter was not a plane. It was a desperate experiment in seeing how much explosive force a human body could be strapped to before it broke. The surviving blueprints show a machine built to save a nation, but the empty launch pole in the woods stands as a monument to a terrifying truth. When a regime runs out of options, the line between technological innovation and human sacrifice simply vanishes. V-3 Supergun. Beneath a chalk hill in the Pas-de-Calais region of northern France, a heavy steel door opens into total darkness. Inside lies a massive labyrinthine complex of subterranean concrete tunnels, carved deep into the earth by the hands of thousands of starving, forced laborers. Branching off from these main railway galleries are steep, smooth shafts, cut perfectly into the bedrock, angled upward at exactly 50 degrees. They point blindly through the rock, aiming across the English Channel toward a city just over 100 miles away. This is the fortress of Mimoyek, the ruined stronghold of the V-3 Supergun. The V-3, or Vergeltungswaffe 3, was not a rocket like the V-2, nor was it a flying bomb like the V-1. It was something entirely different, a multi-chamber cannon known to its engineers by the unsettling code name, the Centipede. The anatomy of the weapon is almost impossible to comprehend as a piece of traditional artillery. The smoothbore barrels were designed to be 150 meters long, buried so deeply inside the mountain that they required an entire underground railway network just to deliver their ammunition. To fire a conventional artillery shell across the channel, the initial explosion in the breech would have to be so massive that it would instantly blow the gun apart. The V-3 bypassed this limitation with a bizarre, creeping geometry. The engineers lined the sides of the massive barrel with angled secondary chambers, arrayed like the legs of a centipede. As the primary charge fired and the shell began to move up the tube, these side chambers would ignite in rapid, perfectly timed sequence. Each explosion would catch the shell as it passed, accelerating the projectile faster and faster until it cleared the mountain. The documented reality of this project is written in the stone of Mimoyekes and the proving grounds at Hillersleben, where the multi-charge physics were tested. We know exactly how much the Allies feared this subterranean stronghold. The effort to destroy the site was so frantic it resulted in experimental drone bomber fatalities, including the death of Joseph Kennedy Jr., and culminated in the use of immense tallboy earthquake bombs that finally collapsed the chalk tunnels. But in the silence of those ruined galleries lies a persistent, terrifying legend regarding what the weapon was actually meant to achieve. Post-war lore often inflates the V-3 into an apocalyptic doomsday weapon. The true psychological terror of the V-3 wasn't about the size of a single explosion, but its rhythm. According to the legend, the multiple shafts of Mimoyekes were designed to fire up to 600 rounds per hour, day and night, without pause. The goal was not targeted destruction, but sheer attrition. It was an automated siege engine designed to ensure that an entire city would never sleep again. The evidence required to prove this nightmare could actually function is missing. Because the complex was destroyed before the long barrels were fully assembled, the final electrical timing mechanisms for the explosive charges are lost to history. We do not have an intact, full-scale barrel to examine. This missing evidence leaves a massive engineering question completely unresolved. The most ordinary explanation suggests the V-3 was a megalomaniacal architectural vanity project. Artillery experts have long argued that the immense thermal stress, combined with the near-impossible timing required for the side charges, would have inevitably caused the 150-meter barrels to melt, jam, or catastrophically detonate inside the mountain after only a few dozen shots. Yet, the more mysterious interpretation lingers. If the timing mechanisms had been perfected, the V-3 represented a conceptual leap toward a weapon of mass psychological destruction that never had to reload. The V-3 Supergun was less a weapon of war and more a piece of subterranean architecture designed for a single purpose: to never stop firing. Today, the ruined tunnels outlive the explanation of their own feasibility. We will never know if the gun would have worked or if the chalk hill would have collapsed under the concussive force of its own ambition. What remains is the eerie, empty space of the underground, a silent monument holding the ghost of a deafening barrage that never came. Me-163 Komet. Before a pilot could even step into the cockpit of this aircraft, he had to put on a heavy, cumbersome flight suit made of specialized, non-organic fabric. This suit was not designed to protect him from the freezing temperatures of the stratosphere, nor was it meant to shield him from the fire of enemy guns. It was designed to protect him from the airplane itself. This was the Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet. It remains the only rocket-powered fighter aircraft ever to see operational combat. In the sky, it was a blindingly fast apparition, screaming upward through bomber formations at nearly 600 miles per hour while trailing a massive plume of white smoke. But the true mystery and lasting horror of the Komet is not what it did to the enemy in the air. It is what it allegedly did to its own pilots on the ground. The anatomy of the Komet was dictated entirely by its volatile propulsion system. Shaped like a smooth, tailless teardrop with swept wings, it looked like a flying seed. But buried inside that small fuselage, wrapping tightly around the pilot's seat, were tanks holding two highly reactive liquid chemicals: T-Stoff, a highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide, and C-Stoff, a hydrazine methanol mixture. These fuels were hypergolic. If they simply touched each other, they exploded into violent, instantaneous thrust. No spark was needed. To save weight and make room for this massive engine, the designers made a fatal compromise. The Komet had no conventional landing gear. It dropped its wheels on takeoff and was designed to land on a single, unsprung metal skid beneath its belly. This mechanical reality birthed one of the most gruesome legends of the Second World War aviation archives: the story of the melting pilots. According to persistent post-war accounts and rumors passed down by ground crews, if a Komet landed too hard on a rough grass airfield, the shockwave would travel straight through the metal skid and rupture the internal fuel lines. The legend claims that crews would rush across the airfield to a plane that had seemingly survived a rough landing, only to open the canopy and find that the pilot had not died from the impact. Instead, leaking T-Stoff had poured into the cockpit, literally dissolving the pilot in his seat before anyone could pull him out. The definitive evidence needed to confirm the true scale of this nightmare is missing. The detailed medical logbooks from the Luftwaffe testing grounds, which would clearly separate traditional blunt force crash trauma from chemical fatalities, were largely destroyed or lost in the chaos of the collapsing regime. We do not have clear photographic evidence of the chemical burns, nor do we have the exact ratio of how many pilots were killed by the enemy versus how many were killed by simply fueling and landing their own machines. Because those exact numbers are missing, the reality is left to the imagination, allowing the legend to grow. It is highly likely that the image of a pilot instantly melting into a puddle is an exaggeration born of wartime trauma. However, the documented chemistry tells a story just as terrifying. T-Stoff is aggressively corrosive to organic material. Even a minor leak in the cockpit would cause horrific chemical burns, and any spilled mixture of the two liquids upon landing would instantly ignite into an uncontrollable inferno. This is where the story shifts from an engineering triumph to an investigative question. We are left to wonder how desperate a military must become to strap its best pilots to tanks of dissolving acid. More German pilots ultimately died in accidents involving the Komet than were ever killed in combat against the Allies. The Me 163 Komet was an engineering miracle in the sky, and a chemical nightmare the second it touched the ground. It survives in the historical record not just as a leap in aviation technology, but as the ultimate mechanical deal with the devil, a machine that demanded a toll in blood before it ever left the runway. V-1 flying bomb. The sky over London in the summer of 1944 was filled with a sound that did not belong to any known aircraft. It was a heavy, rhythmic buzzing, often compared to the engine of a massive, malfunctioning motorcycle. The people below would listen to it drone overhead, waiting. Then, abruptly, the engine would stop. The sky would go dead. And that silence was the most terrifying sound in the world, because the silence meant the machine was falling. This was the V-1 flying bomb, the Vergeltungswaffe 1. It was the world's first operational cruise missile, and its arrival marked the exact moment in history when warfare became entirely automated. The anatomy of the V-1 was stark and mechanical, devoid of any consideration for a human pilot. Measuring 27 feet long, it looked like a small airplane with a heavy steel stovepipe mounted awkwardly on its back. This pipe was the pulse jet engine, which took in air through a grid of metal shutters that snapped open and closed dozens of times a second, creating the weapon's iconic, terrifying buzz. But the most chilling piece of its anatomy sat right on its nose. It was a small propeller, freely spinning in the wind as the bomb flew. This was an anemometer, functioning as a crude odometer. Before launch, ground crews would calculate the exact distance to the target and set a counter connected to the propeller. As the V-1 flew, the propeller ticked backward. When it reached zero, it triggered a mechanism that locked the elevators and cut the fuel lines. The engine would choke into silence, and the bomb would dive. The physical remnants of this campaign are heavily documented. Deep in the French countryside, the concrete ruins of the ski jump launch ramps still point blindly toward England. In military archives, you can find incredible gun camera footage of RAF Spitfire pilots flying wing to wing with the drones, using the airflow of their own wings to physically tip the V-1 over, scrambling its internal gyroscopes and sending it crashing into empty fields. But beneath the documented mechanics lies a much darker post-war legend. After the war ended, claims began to circulate that the blunt, indiscriminate explosions of the V-1 were only the beginning. The rumor suggested that the weapon was actually intended as a delivery system for a far more devastating payload, specifically biological agents or the newly discovered taboon nerve gas. According to these claims, the conventional high-explosive warheads were merely a proof of concept for an apocalyptic chemical blitz that would have rendered London permanently uninhabitable. The evidence required to confirm this nightmare scenario is missing. While we know the German military possessed massive stockpiles of nerve agents, the definitive high-level directives or finalized blueprints proving an active intent to load the V-1 with chemical weapons have never been found. The missing files leave historians with a profound "what if?" We do not know if Hitler seriously considered weaponizing the drone with nerve gas as a final, desperate act, or if this legend is merely the shadow of a terror that never materialized. Furthermore, another kind of evidence is forever missing: the unwritten psychological data of the people on the ground. You cannot fully document the trauma of a population forced to listen to the ticking of an automated clock in the sky. You can only read the memoirs of those who survived the silence. The most ordinary explanation for the V-1 is that it was a cheap, effective terror weapon designed to drain Allied morale and resources without risking German pilots. But its legacy is something far more profound. It opened a Pandora's box of pilotless warfare that we are still dealing with today. The true horror of the V-1 wasn't just the explosion, it was the silence that came right before it, signaling that a machine had finally decided it was time to drop. Fritz X. On September 9, 1943, the Italian battleship Roma was sailing under a clear Mediterranean sky. High above, completely out of reach of the ship's anti-aircraft guns, a solitary German bomber released a heavy payload. The sailors, watching from below, tracked the falling object, expecting the natural, mathematically predictable arc of gravity. Instead, the bomb did something impossible. In midair, it paused its natural trajectory. It banked. It corrected its course, steering itself deliberately toward the ship. It pierced the armored deck, plunged into the forward magazine, and detonated, tearing the massive battleship in half. This was the Fritz X. It was not a conventional weapon. It was the world's first operational precision-guided glide bomb. The anatomy of the Fritz X was completely alien to the naval warfare of the era. Weighing nearly 3,500 pounds and stretching over 10 feet long, it featured 4 stubby aerodynamic fins and a box-shaped tail. But its most vital component was not on the bomb itself. It was inside the bomber aircraft high above, a bulky wired interface known as the Kael-Strasbourg transmitter, operated by a bombardier holding a small analog joystick. When the Fritz X was dropped, a bright flare ignited on its tail. The bombardier stared down through his bomb sight, watching this glowing star fall toward the ocean. By pushing the joystick, he sent invisible radio signals down to the bomb, moving the spoiler surfaces on its tail fins. He was literally flying the explosive into the target. When the Roma went down, and shortly after when the American cruiser USS Savannah was severely crippled by a similar strike, a wave of profound panic swept through Allied Naval Command. Because the radio waves controlling the bomb were invisible, the sailors below had no idea how the weapon was steering. Immediate rumors and wild claims spread through the fleets. Some believed the Germans had invented magnetic attraction or heat-seeking technology. Others whispered that the bombs were fully autonomous, possessing an advanced tracking ability that made them impossible to evade. The terror was rooted in a single, chilling idea: a weapon that could hunt. The evidence of this immediate psychological shock is difficult to fully assemble. The frantic internal naval memos from those first weeks, the desperate attempts by commanders to understand a weapon that seemingly defied the known laws of ballistics, are sparse, largely overshadowed by the frantic technological race that immediately followed. What is missing today is the physical record of the battle that defeated the bomb. The most important engagement of the Fritz X left no physical trace in the sky. To stop the weapon, the Allies had to deploy rudimentary electronic countermeasures, shipborne radio jammers designed to flood the frequency and sever the invisible thread connecting the bombardier to the bomb. Post-war legends often exaggerate this invisible combat, claiming the Allied jammers were so powerful they caused the bombs to perform mid-air U-turns. Because radio waves cannot be put in a display case or preserved in a museum, the true intensity of this invisible jamming war remains an abstract ghost of history. The ordinary explanation grounds the weapon firmly in reality. The Fritz X was not an advanced fire-and-forget missile. If the bomber had to evade enemy fighters, or if a simple cloud obscured the glowing flare on the tail, the bombardier would lose visual contact and the bomb would plunge blindly into the ocean. It was, ultimately, just a gravity bomb with movable fins. But that ordinary reality did not lessen the shock to those on the water. To a sailor in 1943, watching a bomb change direction in the sky looked like dark magic. The Fritz X did not just sink a battleship. It proved that an explosive could be steered through the sky by an invisible electronic thread. It marked the definitive end of blunt force artillery and the terrifying birth of precision warfare. It left history with an unsettling realization that forever changed combat. What do you do when the enemy no longer has to aim, because they can steer? Heinkel, H.E. 162. Deep inside the damp, cavernous expanse of a captured salt mine in 1945, advancing Allied troops discovered an assembly line frozen in time. Sitting in the shadows were hundreds of sleek, half-finished jet fighters. At first glance, they looked like a terrifying leap forward in aviation. But if you walked up to one and touched the wings, you would realize they were not made of aerospace-grade aluminum. They were made of wood, and the seams were already peeling apart. This was the Heinkel He 162, also known as the Volksjäger, the People's Fighter. It was designed and put into production in an astonishing 90 days, and it remains one of the bleakest, most tragic artifacts of the Second World War. The anatomy of the He 162 is deeply unsettling. It was a tiny, tubular fuselage with a powerful BMW jet engine mounted awkwardly, directly on top of the pilot's back. Because the engine intake sat just inches behind the canopy, a pilot attempting a traditional bailout would be instantly sucked into the turbine. To solve this, the engineers had to fit the wooden plane with a highly complex explosive ejection seat. Inside the cramped cockpit, the instruments were drastically simplified, stripped of the usual complexity of a high-performance fighter. They were simplified because this plane was never meant for veteran aviators. It was intended to be flown by the Hitler Youth, teenagers who had only ever been trained on basic wooden gliders, suddenly strapped into a jet capable of over 500 miles per hour. After the war, a certain legend attached itself to the Heinkel 162. Some aviation enthusiasts and alternate history writers framed it as a brilliant, minimalist masterpiece. The myth suggests that this was the ultimate disposable plane, a cheap, mass-produced wonder weapon that, had it been given just a few more months, could have swarmed the skies and overwhelmed the Allied bomber fleets through sheer numbers. But the documented evidence tells a horrifyingly different story. Because Germany had run out of metal, the wings were carved from wood. Because the factory that produced the specialized Tego film wood glue had been bombed into rubble by the British, the engineers were forced to use a hastily manufactured substitute. They soon discovered a fatal flaw. The substitute glue was highly acidic. It was literally eating away at the wooden joints from the inside. During test flights, the He-162 had a terrifying tendency to simply disintegrate in mid-air, shedding its wings under the immense stress of jet-powered flight, sending its pilots plummeting to their deaths. The exact evidence that would reveal the full scale of this self-inflicted slaughter is missing. We do not have the complete, intact flight logs of the youth training programs, nor do we know the true casualty rate of the test pilots who died because their aircraft dissolved around them. The chaotic, slapdash production blueprints from the underground factories leave the final human cost unresolved. We do not know exactly how many teenagers were put into these cockpits in the final weeks of the war. What remains open is a chilling question about the psychology of the regime. Why did experienced, brilliant aeronautical engineers agree to build a machine they knew would likely kill the user? The Heinkel 162 wasn't an advanced weapon. It was an act of desperation, a jet engine strapped to a wooden box waiting for a child to fly it. It stands not as a marvel of engineering, but as the physical manifestation of a dying empire. It forces us to look at the rotting wooden wings in the museum and ask, what happens when a regime runs out of metal, runs out of men, but refuses to run out of war? Messerschmitt Me-262. In the summer of 1944, high in the freezing air over Europe, an American P-51 Mustang pilot looked out of his canopy and saw something impossible. Streaking through the Allied bomber formation was an aircraft moving nearly 100 miles an hour faster than any conventional fighter in the world. It tore through the sky with effortless speed, leaving no sound until it was already gone. But the most terrifying detail was what it lacked. The machine had no propellers. This was the Messerschmitt Me-262. It was the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft, and its arrival in the skies over Germany birthed the most famous and fiercely debated "what if" in the archives of military aviation. The anatomy of the Me-262 looked like an apex predator. It featured a sleek, shark-like fuselage and distinct swept-back wings, a design choice made not for supersonic speeds but simply to balance the aircraft's center of gravity. Hanging beneath those swept wings were the plane's defining features: two massive, barrel-like Jumo 004 axial-flow jet engine pods. The documented reality of the Me-262 is that it was devastatingly effective in the air, armed with heavy cannons that could tear a heavy bomber apart in a single pass. But the plane is surrounded by a massive, persistent post-war legend regarding why it failed to turn the tide of the war. According to this legend, heavily promoted after the war by surviving German fighter commanders like Adolf Galland, the Me-262 was a flawless, war-winning weapon that was ruined by a single man. The story claims that Adolf Hitler obsessively intervened in the deployment of the aircraft, issuing the infamous Schnellbomber Decree. He demanded that the fighter be modified to carry bombs, a meddling order that supposedly delayed the deployment of pure fighter squadrons by critical months, denying Germany the ability to clear the skies. It is an intoxicating alternate history, but when you move past the post-war memoirs and look at the physical evidence, the myth begins to tear itself apart. The exact, verbatim transcripts of the arguments between the generals and high command are missing, leaving historians to rely on self-serving memoirs that naturally deflect blame. But the critical piece of missing evidence that unravels the legend is found deep inside the supply chain. To function safely, the turbine blades inside the revolutionary jet engines required incredibly high-temperature, heat-resistant alloys, specifically chromium and nickel. But by 1944, the German war machine had completely run out of these rare metals. The engineers were forced to manufacture the delicate internal blades out of inferior steel. As a result, the engines had a catastrophic lifespan of only 10 to 25 hours of flight. After that brief window, the immense thermal stress would cause the turbine blades to literally stretch, melt, or snap off, destroying the engine from the inside out and frequently turning the aircraft into a fireball. The legend insists that the Hitler delay ruined the plane. But the missing high-quality metal proves that even if the dictator had never uttered a word about bombers, the German metallurgical industry was fundamentally incapable of producing reliable jet engines at the necessary scale. There are no lost production logs showing massive stockpiles of perfect engines waiting to be used. They did not exist. Furthermore, the jets were so vulnerable while accelerating and decelerating that Allied pilots simply adopted the tactic of hovering over German airfields, shooting the miraculous jets down as they tried to land. We prefer the myth of the meddling dictator because it is a simple, dramatic narrative. It suggests that the science was perfect, and only human arrogance ruined it. But the legend of the Me-262 claims it was a war-winning weapon delayed by a whim, while the actual metal tells a different story. It forces us to ask an uncomfortable historical question. Does a weapon fail because of a bad order, or because the math of war finally catches up to the science? Ultimately, the Me-262 proves that technology can outpace the enemy in the sky, but it cannot outrun a broken supply chain on the ground. V-2 rocket. On a quiet morning in September 1944, a city block in London suddenly erupted into dust and fire. There was no air raid siren. There was no drone of approaching engines. The devastation was instantaneous. Seconds after the explosion, a terrifying, tearing roar echoed across the sky. The weapon had arrived faster than the speed of sound. This was the Vergeltungswaffe II, the V-2 rocket. It was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile and the first artificial object to cross the boundary of space. The anatomy of the V-2 was undeniably futuristic. It stood 46 feet tall, a towering cylinder of smooth metal painted in stark black and white patterns, resting on 4 aerodynamic fins. Inside, intricate gyroscopes guided the missile, while its massive combustion chamber burned a volatile mixture of ethanol and liquid oxygen, producing a thrust that could hurl a 1-ton warhead to the edge of the stratosphere. But to understand the true mystery of the V-2, you cannot look at the sky. You must look underground. The physical remnants of the V-2 program are split between 2 vastly different historical archives. On one side are the celebrated files of the space race, detailing how Wernher von Braun and his team used this exact technology to eventually take humanity to the moon. On the other side is the dark, suffocating reality of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp, carved deep into the Kohnstein mountain in central Germany. The V-2 was not built in clean, sterile laboratories. It was welded together in pitch-black, freezing, ammonia-choked tunnels by thousands of starving, forced laborers. During the Cold War, a massive, carefully cultivated post-war legend was constructed around the V-2. To justify utilizing the German engineers in the American and Soviet space programs, a narrative of the reluctant scientist was born. The myth claimed that the V-2 was a pure dream of space exploration, hijacked by a desperate military, and that brilliant men like von Braun were purely focused on the stars, largely unaware of, or powerless to stop, the atrocities committed in the tunnels below the launch pads. Another layer of the legend claims that the incredibly high failure rate of the rockets was due to a silent, heroic campaign of intentional sabotage by the inmates assembling the delicate internal pumps with their bare hands. The evidence needed to fully unpack these legends is missing, and in some cases intentionally erased. As the Allies closed in, the SS deliberately destroyed many of the camp's death registers. The names of thousands of victims who perished in the tunnels are permanently missing from the historical record. Also missing or heavily redacted are the full, unfiltered early debriefing transcripts from Operation Paperclip, the exact conversations where the architects of the V-2 traded their knowledge of the future for amnesty for the past. We do not know precisely how much complicity was swept under the rug to win the space race. We do know from surviving inmate testimony that von Braun and other top engineers walked through those tunnels. We know the atrocities were not a secret to them. The conflicting narratives force us to confront an uncomfortable historical reality. We cling to the myth of the innocent scientists because the alternative is too horrifying to accept. The V-2 rocket holds a unique, horrifying place in military history. It is the only weapon ever created that killed more people in its construction than it did in its destruction. An estimated 5,000 people died from its supersonic impacts, but up to 20,000 enslaved human beings were worked to death building it inside the mountain. The blueprint for mankind's greatest achievement was drafted in the darkest depths of hell, leaving history with a haunting, unresolved question. Can humanity's reach for the stars ever truly be separated from the blood on the launch pad? Tabungas. Deep in the German forests in the spring of 1945, advancing Allied chemical warfare teams breached a series of hidden underground bunkers. Inside, sitting in absolute, chilling silence, they found rows upon rows of artillery shells and aerial bombs. Each munition was marked with a distinct painted green ring. Inside the casings was a clear, slightly brownish liquid. It had sat there for years, untouched. If a single drop of this liquid had touched the skin of an advancing soldier, his central nervous system would have violently collapsed within minutes. This was Tabun, part of the Third Reich's massive, highly classified nerve gas program. The discovery of these untouched stockpiles unlocked one of the most chilling psychological mysteries of the Second World War. The anatomy of this weapon was not born in a military laboratory, but in a civilian one. In 1936, a German chemist attempting to invent a more effective agricultural pesticide accidentally synthesized a compound that was lethally toxic to the human nervous system. Recognizing its horrific potential, the German military seized the research. They built a massive manufacturing plant at Dieernfurth, operating under the darkest secrecy, and began stockpiling thousands of tons of Tabun, and later, an even more lethal variant known as sarin. The munitions were specifically designed for mass battlefield annihilation. The shells were engineered to burst in midair above enemy lines, creating an invisible, toxic rain that could penetrate standard gas masks and absorb directly through the skin. The documented reality discovered by the Allies in 1945 was terrifying. The German military held a monopoly on the apocalypse. The Allies possessed stockpiles of older World War I-era chemical weapons like mustard gas, but they had absolutely no equivalent to these new nerve agents, nor did they have any effective medical countermeasures. If deployed, Tabun could have turned the European theater into a total graveyard, yet they never used it. This is where the historical record hits a dark, unresolved void. Why did a regime that committed the Holocaust, a regime that was actively gassing millions of innocent people in extermination camps using Zyklon B, refuse to use its most devastating battlefield weapon, even as its empire was collapsing into rubble? The definitive evidence that could answer this question is missing. There is no single, signed directive from High Command specifically forbidding the deployment of nerve gas. We do not have the complete files detailing if they ever truly intended to load these chemicals into the V-2 rockets. The absence of a final why has allowed several competing theories and legends to fill the silence. Some historians point to German intelligence failures. It is heavily reported that German commanders falsely believed the Allies had discovered nerve agents as well, and feared that launching a chemical strike would invite a devastating retaliation that their failing logistics simply could not handle. After the war, high-ranking officials like Albert Speer claimed that they had actively sabotaged the final orders to initiate chemical warfare, though these claims are heavily disputed as self-serving post-war fictions designed to save their own lives at Nuremberg. Another persistent theory suggests a psychological barrier. It is often claimed that Adolf Hitler's own traumatic experience of being temporarily blinded by mustard gas in the trenches of the First World War left him with a deep, personal aversion to the tactical use of chemical weapons on the battlefield. But we cannot confirm what was truly in the mind of the High Command during those final, desperate weeks. Because the definitive orders are missing, the mystery remains entirely psychological. We are forced to look at a regime defined by total lack of moral boundaries and realize that a single, invisible line was drawn in the dirt, and no one fully knows why. Sometimes the greatest mystery in the archives is not the weapon that destroyed a city, but the terror that was left sitting silently in the dark. The stockpiles of Tabun stand as a chilling historical paradox. An empire held the apocalypse in a bottle and simply decided not to open it. When you look at these machines today, resting quietly under the bright, sterile lights of aerospace museums, it is easy to be seduced by the shape of the metal. Stripped of the corrosive fuels, the rotting wood, the acidic glue, and the pitch-black tunnels where they were welded together, they look like pure science fiction. We look at the swept wings, the jet engines, and the massive rockets, and it is easy to understand why the legends of the wonder weapons were born. But, as we have seen by opening the archives, the physical hardware only tells half the story. The rest of the truth is hidden in what is missing: the destroyed medical logs, the redacted intelligence debriefings, the vanished blueprints, the missing telemetry of doomed pilots, and the erased names of the thousands of laborers who paid the ultimate price in the dark. The myths surrounding these weapons survive because they offer a clean, compelling narrative. We want to believe in secret stealth bombers, endless subterranean superguns, and war-winning jets delayed by a single meddling order. We prefer the myth of the genius machine because it distracts us from the reality of a desperate, collapsing empire that was perfectly willing to trade human lives for a few extra miles per hour. History has carefully preserved the hardware, but the evidence that truly matters, the exact human cost, the final unspoken intentions, and the silent terrors of the people who had to hear these machines falling from the sky, remains buried, destroyed, or lost to time. These weapons did not save the regime that built them. Instead, they became phantoms. They stand as monuments to the terrifying moment when warfare became automated, when explosives became guided, and when the ladder to the stars was built in the darkest depths of hell. They leave us with a heavy, unresolved question that no museum display can ever fully answer. How much of our modern world was drafted in the dark